Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with the first impressions video of the T-45 Goshawk. But wait, I hear you saying, didn't you already do one of those? Well, yes, in DCS. Today, the astute amongst you will have noted that although we are in a familiar stomping grounds, taking off from Batumi, we're not, in fact, in DCS. Today, we're looking at the T-45 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. And while I do want to spend some time talking about the module in Microsoft Flight Simulator, I figured that comparisons to DCS are inevitable, so I decided why not make the similarities and differences obvious by doing a flight that actually I have done countless times in DCS. Instead, I will do it in Microsoft Flight Simulator in the T-45. So, we've taken off out of Batumi. We're going to head up into the mountains, and then we're going to come back around, fly down one of the valleys, and then we'll fly up the coast a ways, and then we'll come in and land at Senaki, just as I've done in lots of DCS flights. So it'll give us a chance to compare things kind of one-to-one. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about the T-45 and why the T-45 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. As I'm sure most of you know, there is a very good T-45 mod for DCS, and a free mod, I might add, whereas the T-45 in Microsoft Flight Simulator is a paid module. So, why pay for an experience in Microsoft Flight Simulator that you can have for free in DCS? Well, I guess that's actually kind of the point. I have for a while been wanting to be able to compare Microsoft Flight Simulator and DCS directly. There are a number of airplanes that you can fly in both. A lot of them are paid modules in both sims, like the F-14 and the F-18 and maybe the A-10. Now, I own the F-18 and the A-10 in DCS, but I don't fly them a lot. Others are free in DCS, but are paid in Microsoft Flight Simulator, like the A-4 and the T-45. I could have tried the Microsoft Flight Simulator A4, since I fly the Skyhawk a lot in DCS, and it's honestly a fantastic mod, but doesn't really have a great reputation in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So in the end, I picked the T-45 because I think it's a good free mod in DCS, and the payware model in Microsoft Flight Simulator was pretty highly rated, so I decided to give it a try. I also picked it in some ways because it seemed like the most, useful plane in Microsoft Flight Simulator, because its main purpose in life is to practice basic flying skills and things like instrument flying and navigation, which are things you do a lot of in Microsoft Flight Simulator, at least I do. Since you can't really exercise the weapon systems on those other aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator, they seem like they wouldn't be all that well suited to it. So, after all that, I picked the T-45 for Microsoft Flight Simulator by IndiaFoxTecho. And I'm glad I did. I'm really enjoying the chance to fly the T-45 in both sims and to be able to compare them. And I'm also finding that I get some excellent instrument navigation and approach practice in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is easier to set up than in DCS, and which I can do anywhere in the whole world. But here's the thing. The skills that I learn in Microsoft Flight Simulator are pretty much directly transferable to DCS, so I find it pretty useful cross-training. The other thing about flying in Microsoft Flight Simulator is that it really does look better than DCS. I don't notice a whole lot of difference inside the aircraft, but Microsoft Flight Simulator really still does hold the edge when it comes to the way the scenery looks. As I'm sure you've been noticing, as we have been flying over the mountains outside of Batumi, there just really is an edge to Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's just a bit more detailed, I guess, a little bit more photorealistic, which probably comes from the fact that it really is based on satellite photographs. It really does support a generally higher frame rate, at least on my hardware, with similar quality settings to DCS. So, the other thing is that, last and really not least, The external camera controls in Microsoft Flight Simulator are just head and shoulders above DCS. So setting up all of these cinematic shots is just a whole lot less work in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I find that I can do a lot more things a lot more easily than I can in DCS. So, overall, I'm really happy that I picked up the T-45 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. For one thing, it lets me fly at speeds in excess of 350 knots without needing to sit in a massive airliner. I mean, that's one itch that is tough to scratch in Microsoft Flight Simulator in its stock form. There are fast planes, and there are planes that are just fun to fly. But there aren't a lot of fast planes that are just fun to fly. And my apologies to the airliner crowd, that's not meant to be offensive. I understand why flying a 747 and doing it well would be an interesting challenge. It's just not one that appeals to me. I've always been more attracted to stick and rudder flying, and the T-45 provides that. It's not fly-by-wire. You have to manually control all of the control surfaces, and it won't stop you from doing something stupid and pay for it, which I actually like. It has excellent vision pretty much all the way around, so it's great for sightseeing, which, let's face it, is one of the best things about Microsoft Flight Simulator. It climbs out quickly to altitude when you take off. It cruises at a decent rate of knots, and it's agile enough to do some aerobatics if you want to, if that's your thing. It has a full navigation suite, and that lets you practice flying to a flight plan using inertial nav and GPS, or using VOR DME, or TACAN. And it supports a full instrument landing system approach using both horizontal and vertical localizers. It also has the full T-45 HUD and all the functional multifunction displays that you can see me interacting with here. I'm actually doing a little bit of instrument nav. I'm not explaining what I'm doing. I'd probably do another video and talk a little bit about instrument nav in the T-45 in both the DCS and Microsoft Flight Simulator versions. Because it has a fully functional HUD, it means that you have all of the landing aids, including the staple and the AOA indicator, that I talked about in the landing video that I did a while back. Now, it does have one massive limitation in the Microsoft Flight Simulator version. It's a limitation that the developers try to kind of minimize in their documentation. And I think that's because it's a limitation that Microsoft Flight Simulator itself imposes on them, and not one that they can correct, but I think it's more serious than they give it credit. And this is the fact that the HUD is not collimated, which is a word they use, which basically means that the HUD symbology moves around over the ground as you move your head. This is a major issue when you're trying to land, because it means that the flight path vector does not, in fact, accurately reflect where the jet's going. And it's really a pretty big deal based on the way that you want to learn to land this jet. And it was almost a deal breaker for me, I have to admit. It was almost a reason why I didn't want to fly this jet. But I find that in practice, I've become pretty good at working around it, mostly by getting the right head position and then trying not to move my head too much while I'm landing. But so it's not the best solution, but I still hope that it's something that can eventually be corrected in Microsoft Flight Simulator, because a lot of the other things about the jet I really enjoy. So you can see that we are now coming up the coast to this big, I don't know if it's a lake or an inland reservoir between Senaki and Koboleti, and we're just about going to turn in onto our vector for Senaki. You can see that I'm just changing the scale of the display there, and you can see that pretty soon we're going to get to the point we're going to want to turn in, and you can just appreciate the scenery, which again, as I said, is I find it's a lot more detailed in Microsoft Flight Simulator than DCS. Now, here in a minute, though, I'm going to once I get on final, I have some video of doing exactly the same approach in DCS, so I think I'll be able to actually show the two sims side by side, which I think will be kind of interesting. So the T-45 in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it flies, I think, very similarly to how it does in DCS. It's good and stable. I haven't had a chance to do a detailed comparison of things like speeds and rates of climb and that sort of thing. It's comparable. I don't think it's exactly the same. For one thing, I think the engine might be a little bit less responsive than the way it's modeled in the DCS version, which starts to have an impact when you're landing. But I wouldn't say that for sure without some more testing. It certainly doesn't feel, the two jets don't feel markedly different in the two simulators, and that's why I say that it's actually quite useful. I can sort of get cross-training by flying in either one, and you can see I'm just checking the right-hand multifunction display. I need the airport symbol there to basically be under the tip of the white arrow, and then we'll know that we're just about ready to turn in and find Senaki out there somewhere. So, of course, the one thing that you can't do, well, you can't do as well as you can in DCS. You certainly can't do carrier landings nearly as well or nearly as immersively in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, apparently there is a aircraft carrier module that is coming out. It's a paid module, but as far as I can tell, it's basically a stationary aircraft carrier. It's basically just some textures that have been wrapped around a static sort of lump in the ground. So I'm not sure how well that's going to work. And compare that to the carrier experience in DCS, it's not even going to be a competition. So, all right, we're just getting ready to turn into Senaki. So the main thing for me, as I said, is T-45 and Microsoft Flight Simulator gives me access to the same kind of experience that I can get in DCS, but with the more attractive scenery and with the ability to basically fly anywhere in the world. And that kind of flexibility. So I enjoy that. I enjoy it as the link between the two simulators. There's definitely things that I will only be able to do in DCS and only want to do. I just did a video on dropping bombs on the range in DCS. Clearly not going to be doing that in Microsoft Flight Simulator. But when I want to do some instrument nav or just some sightseeing in a military-style jet, then it's not a bad idea to do that in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Okay, so I think I'm well enough lined up. Let's bring in the other sim here for a sec. So on the left you have the T-45 in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and on the right you have the T-45 in DCS. And this provides an interesting comparison. You can immediately see the issue with the flight path vector. The jets are configured similarly for landing, but the flight path vector is in quite a different place on the screen in DCS, and it's more correct. But gives you a chance to see that the two cockpits are very similar. You can see the subtle differences, but you can also see the real difference in the terrain. Okay, so we're getting the gear down and the flaps down on the DCS side on the right. Haven't done that on the Microsoft Flight Simulator side on the left yet, so there's a little bit of differences there. But we're getting ourselves lined up on the runway. And here comes the gear on the Microsoft side. Okay, so now we're getting the symbologies the same. Doing the same thing, but trimming out both sides to try and get the FPV up into the staple. So the position of the FPV on the staple is correct on the Microsoft side. It's just its position on the ground. As you can see, I can move it up and down just by moving my head, which is not desirable. Alright, so we're getting them both sorted out. So you can definitely see the differences in the terrain. Albeit there's a little bit of differences in the lighting, so it's not entirely fair, but you can certainly see there's a lot more detail on the Microsoft side. It just feels like there's a little bit more, I don't know, texture. And it's a little finer. The buildings are finer. The terrain details are finer. Just overall, it's more attractive. I don't think it's unfair to say that. But it's giving you a good chance to look at both aircraft as we're coming in. You can see they both handle fairly similarly. It's taken me a little longer to get myself sorted with the Microsoft side to get the AOA right. And once we get it settled down, things look pretty similar. And I'm managing to get the flight path vector in about the right place so that it's accurate. But again, I can move it up and down just by moving my head, which is the issue. There we go. Both established at about the same speeds. Good AOA. You can see I'm jockeying the power a little bit more on the Microsoft side, and I think that, again, I think the engine is a little bit less responsive, which means you end up doing a little bit more of the jockeying and kind of chasing the curve. I have to say I only really notice that when I fly the two aircraft one after the other. If I didn't do that, it would be hard to notice. So we dispensed with the DCS one. I thought it was really interesting to see them both at the same time. Now we'll just finish this off in the Microsoft version of the T-45. So bottom line on the T-45 is I think it's a worthwhile module. If you want to spend the money on it in Microsoft Flight Simulator, I think it's worth doing. I think it adds a dimension to Microsoft Flight Simulator that's not there in the stock game. I think it's a pretty faithful representation of the jet, based on assuming that the DCS version is also pretty accurate. I'm enjoying flying it. I'm getting a lot of use out of it, doing some navigation exercises and some instrument flying, and I find it's a nice complement to the DCS version. So just about down, and we're home and dry. One little nose wheel bounce. So I hope you enjoyed that first impressions video of the Microsoft Flight Simulator version of the T-45, kind of in its DCS homeland, let's say. So I'd be interested to know in the comments how many people are flying some of the jets in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and how you're finding them compared to the experience in DCS. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, please like the video and do subscribe to the channel. And for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.